policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he served as research director for the Center for Public Leadership. He has his A.B. in psychology from Yale University, an M.A. in psychology from Harvard, and a Ph.D. in organizational behavior from the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and the Harvard Business School. So we're really honored and excited to have him with us today. I want to talk about a few logistical things before we begin. We will pause at several points during the presentation to share your questions with Todd. So therefore, to ask your question, remember everybody's in listen mode right now, so to ask a question, type it into the question box of your webinar controls. Once you submit those questions, I will receive them and post them to Todd during these breaks in his comments. Please submit your questions throughout the entire presentation whenever the information strikes you. We will collect questions throughout. We will rebroadcast this presentation afterwards, typically within 48 hours. You will receive an email with information to access the rebroadcast. So, without further ado, allow me to introduce Todd Pittinsky and Intergroup Leadership, what it is, why it matters, and how it is done.
Okay, thank you, Janet, very much. Thank you to the ILA for inviting me to participate in the webinar series. And thank you to you, the participants, for sort of joining in this conversation and making the time to be a part of it. I'd like to begin by just throwing out a few acknowledgements. This area of work that I've been working on, this idea of intergroup leadership and trying to understand it both in a theoretical perspective but also in a practical one, has benefited tremendously from the ideas and assistance of many talented colleagues. And I also want to mention that very early in this work, and as you'll see, it's really sort of a general intuition or idea, so I don't want to overstate how far along I am in the work, but it occurred to me that it would benefit from getting a lot of diverse perspectives and or opinions and sort of research lenses. And so I edited a volume on intergroup leadership, Crossing the Divide. And so the authors who generously participated in that work really helped enrich in the discourse and discussion around what might come of this, this perspective or this approach to thinking about leadership. Let me, at the outset, take a quick minute and give you a sense of how I'm proposing to organize the talk. I'm going to begin by giving you some background. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolution of the ideas, some of the sort of basic tenets. Then I'm going to propose or discuss the specific approach to intergroup leadership that I've been looking at in my own work, and then talk about, we'll continue on to talk about one particular application, and then really open it up. And Janet mentioned that as you go, you should throw in questions, but in addition, if there's comments, I'd certainly welcome those as well. So please do think of this as a discussion. This is one of the first times I'm presenting in a webinar format over the internet. So without the benefit of the face-to-face feedback, the written feedback will be very helpful to help steer the conversation in directions that are most helpful. So beginning with the background, in some sense, the sort of notion of working on intergroup leadership, when I think about it, really was sort of an outgrowth of sort of the career or the academic trajectory that I took. And so as an undergraduate, I was very interested in intergroup relations, which is really just the sort of technical way scientists talk about us and them and how us and them get along and how often us and them don't get along. And us and them can be in the context of religious difference, it could be in the context of national difference, it could be context of ethnic difference, but it could also be in the context of other types of groups and other types of difference. So for example, organizational units with different agendas and different philosophies. And one of the things that they talk about in intergroup relations is the danger of too cohesive a group. And what intergroup relations research, starting from very, very early research by Sharif and others, said when a group gets very cohesive, it can be problematic for the group's relationship with other groups. I then went on as a graduate student to study management and leadership, and what I thought was interesting there is in many of the normative or prescriptive models of leadership, one of the things they emphasize is the value or utility of promoting cohesion. And that sort of trajectory of starting from an intergroup lens that said, wait a minute, cohesion is a potential liability to the quality of relations across lines of difference, and then later moving on to think about leadership and read about leadership and see how sort of bullish leadership studies was about the idea of building cohesion, sort of made me think, that maybe there are some really big externalities. And how do we think about models of leadership that might not have that potential downside or risk? And so that started me thinking about intergroup leadership. And what I mean when I say intergroup leadership is really leadership that is enacted across salient groups. And the word salient really just means, or is just there to sensitize us to the fact that it's not always the case that group differences are meaningful. But intergroup leadership would be the kind of leadership that has to happen when those differences are very salient. So if you think about folks who are interested in leadership across the aisle, that would be an example where political divides are very salient, and the leadership has to happen across groups. Or you can think of societies and cultures at different times that are either ethnically or politically very divided. And so, again, I'm keeping the word salient in there because in some sense you could argue intergroup leadership always has to happen, right? Because every group has some constituent subgroups. But in some sense, those constituent subgroups are not always salient. They're not always meaningful. They're not always in the moment influencing how people think, feel, and behave. So just a quick sort of note about intergroup leadership. For some leaders, it could be the end. It could be what they seek. And in that sense, it's their goal, right? They may specifically set out to lead across other groups. But in other cases, it can simply be a means. And those would be cases where the leader, his or herself, is not particularly motivated to see the working across the difference as the end goal, but it's much more instrumental to the achievement of other goals. And it can occur in either of those contexts. And when I started to sort of compare this sort of concern to how traditional, or to think about leadership studies more generally, it became increasingly clear. So this is the arc of the research cycle when you're suddenly convinced everyone has missed something, and then you read and you think, well, maybe I'm the one who's missed something, and it sort of goes back and forth. But it did seem that there's a piece of the leadership puzzle that was missing. And if you look over leadership theory and you read what traditional scholars have concerned themselves with, they really talk about assembling diverse individuals rather than diverse subgroups. And it's not to say that they don't it's not to say that they're explicitly ruling out subgroups, but their wisdom really talks about tapping the passions of followers in a very undifferentiated or in a very general way. And in addition, our leadership theories very often focus on the relations that leaders have with followers and less on relations among followers. And if you think about intergroup leadership, what it's really sensitizing us to is the fact that the followers as a group are not an undifferentiated group of individuals, but really they're different subgroups of individuals, and both levels are alive, and both levels are consequential and influential to leadership dynamics. So in that sense, it seemed that there were things that had been sort of undermined in traditional leadership theory that this approach could help sort of advance. It also seemed, if you look at sort of traditional leadership writing, that it is the case that a leader's own affiliations often can be a trap. So if you look at sort of case studies, if you look at some of the work on social identity approaches to leadership, we see that it can be hard for a leader to rise above his or her own natural affiliations. And it can be hard either because of impulses in the leader, his or herself, or it can be because followers don't necessarily trust a leader from a subgroup. So this is one area that we've seen some interesting work. And you can see that there can be the case of favoritism, where a leader favors his or her own in-group. But it also seems that it's just a more endemic or more, just a more pervasive phenomenon. And that's because when you establish credibility and you mobilize followers, it's just more difficult to be perceived as fair, and more difficult when the followers are from different groups. And that would be work, David de Kremer's done some interesting work in this regard. Mike Hogue and colleagues have done some interesting work in this regard, that it's not just a function of the leader being favoring the group, but that we even, there's a natural or almost endemic distrust that we have, or suspicion that followers will have of leaders when they come from specific groups. So intergroup relations is a wonderful field of scholarly work where there's been so much rich inquiry, and that inquiry has actually led to some really interesting prescriptive work as well. One of the classic findings is the power of common goals, and a shorthand way to think about that would be us works with them. And so work in this regard shows, well, if you have different subgroups, and the implication for leadership would be, to the extent that you can focus the groups on common or shared goals, that's a source to achieve both leadership objectives, but also to allow the subgroups to work together in a more unified followership. There's other terrific work that looks at common identity, so it's less focused on what the presenting task is, but really about the sort of psychological construal. And this would be really trying to tap, either create new identities, or potentially to tap existing overlapping or overarching identities. And so this would be the we strategy, which is we as Americans in the case of the US, we as Europe in the case of the EU, we as Asia in the case of the discussions around sort of an Asian trading bloc, anything that taps a common identity. And or at different times you can see that leaders have actually sought to create this identity. So they've actually tried to create a we. We certainly see this in organizations where people don't necessarily come in with an organizational identity, but the leaders or the institution as well tries to craft it and really reinforce it, and it becomes consequential. Work identities become very important to how people feel about themselves. There's been some more recent work that I would argue is sort of a nuance on the common identity, which is really trying to grapple with the robustness of pluralism. And by the robustness of pluralism, or I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's really sort of recognize the impulse that, well, if identity is important to people, but the common identity in number two is a powerful strategy, how is it that leaders can walk sort of both sides of the line? And that work looks at the conditions and sort of the experience of having dual identities, which is a very strong sense of the subgroup us, but also concurrently a powerful sense of a shared or overlapping we. And so researchers have tried to puzzle out, is that possible? Second, under which conditions? And then third, and it's been less of a concern, is how do leaders do that? So what exactly would you do if you're trying to promote a dual identity among a followership? Again, recognizing that your followership has subgroups in it. This fourth bullet is the area where I focused my attention, I guess, over the last 9 years. So it's been a long-term project, and as I mentioned at the beginning, it's only beginning. But it's also the area where I'm going to spend the bulk of the time today talking about, because it's the area of intergroup leadership that I've done the most work. And what it is saying, if you look at the different models, the area or the setting that I'm most interested in is the conditions under which it's an, excuse me, an us and a them, but us likes them. And so I've become more and more interested and more persuaded that there's a power to thinking about difference, but thinking about positive orientation towards difference, and how do we begin to theorize that when, and this will be quite a bit of today's talk, so much of our science of intergroup relations is predicated on us and them equaling us dislikes them. And so much of our leadership work in that area has been really about how do leaders reduce dislike. And the basic argument of the positive attitudes sort of approach that I'm adopting, this sort of allophilia model that I'll talk about, is that the leadership task of reducing positive attitudes is not, of reducing negative attitudes is not the same thing as increasing positive ones. And that there are actually two independent activities that leaders need to be thinking about. So let me pause there before I begin to talk a little bit more about this particular model that I've been working on, this allophilia or two-dimensional model. And I've gone through quite a bit of of the evolution of the work that I've been doing, but also thrown at you quite a bit of summary statements about, over 100 years of intergroup research. So let me pause here and ask for questions or comments.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that have to do with the assumptions underlying this relative to game theory or leader-member exchange theory.
Terrific. Are there any additional comments as part of that, or should I?
Those are what's come up.
Yeah, no, I'm really, so, I'll give you an example. One of the ways that I've approached this, so I'm interested in experimental designs, and so I've tried to create little laboratory experiments where I can create groups that work on behalf of the other. And just to give you a sense, I was talking, so one of the payoff schemes, and so it was one of the things I did was I modeled, and this is a U.S. context, but I worked with students at Duke and students at University of North Carolina. And folks who are familiar with those institutions will recognize that they have quite a bit of rivalry around basketball. It's one of the bigger university rivalries. But they also have, as part of the research triangle, they also have some shared interests, or they have some regional sort of collaboration. So there's quite a bit of cross-pollination of researchers and even in some cases students. So it's a potentially interesting example where you could argue that you could really see quite a bit of negativity and competition, but then you could also see some benefit or members of the groups. And so in designing that study, we went through the traditional kind of payoff matrix where we had, you could give all of the resources to your own university, the maximum. You could give most of the resources to your university, or you could share it equitably. And when I went to design the experiment, I had an additional condition, which was max other. So, the max in-group preference would be to give the most to your own group. And so I added in the condition max other because I was fairly confident that there would be some interaction between some of the quote-unquote leadership manipulations we were putting in and some of the individual dispositions of the students that would get some of them to that behavior. A colleague in economics looked at it and said, oh, you don't have to bother running that condition. And I said, what condition? And he said, the condition under which max other, it never happens. So what I would argue is that, that there's a tension between commonly expressed behavior that's captured very well in game theory and what I would call, or what others would call positive deviant behavior, which would be the extremities that we can sometimes observe in behavior and that arguably, I would argue that as leadership scholars we should be most interested in, because in some sense thinking about leadership is thinking about deviance. It may be positive deviance. In the case of this research interest group, it may be pro-social deviance, but very often it's deviance. So it's moving in a different direction than the system otherwise would. So in terms of how this fits in methodologically, I would use some of their payoff metrics, but philosophically I would begin from a slightly different orientation, which if traditional economics comes from an assumption of the individual is motivated to maximize his or her self-interest, I would say that I'm interested in using the tools of game theory, but beginning with a slightly different place, that under some conditions, some people are actually interested in maximizing the welfare of others. And so that leads to a slight difference in terms of how we operationalize the different, or how we expect, or even the types of interventions that we use. So I hope that provides some sort of connection between the literatures you're interested in and the current discussion.
I encourage everybody to continue to send questions because it's really helpful in deepening this discussion and to move forward. Here we go.
Terrific. Okay, so I mentioned that I'm interested in this us and them and the conditions under which us can be positively oriented towards them. And the shorthand way that I use to refer to these sort of attitudes and behaviors across lines of difference would be to think about allophilia. And I'll begin by asking, what is the opposite of prejudice? And I've asked this question to a lot of different audiences, and very often they stop and they sort of think, and I've done it in 17 different languages in terms of giving different talks in different countries, but also asking students to think about their host language, and using English as sort of the anchor. We come up with most frequently tolerance. Second would be acceptance, and the third most common is respect. But there does seem to be, at least semantically, and you could argue that semantics reflects our mindset, the similar sentiment that the word tolerance is surely imperfect. And this is not me speaking, this is tolerance.org. So even proponents who use this metaphor or mindset of tolerance as what we should be moving towards recognize that there is something, and I'm not sure if the word is bold enough, because I would argue that it's not scientific enough. Because if you're looking for an opposite of prejudice, which is, an antipathy, a disregard, an active dislike, a hatred based on group membership, that tolerance would not be the opposite of it, right? Tolerance would be something that we could argue is useful, but the primary limitation, and this is something that I'm looking at in a book project now, is really that we've brought certain assumptions about how individuals are capable of behaving in the context of difference, and that's really squashed a lot of our ambition in terms of thinking about how difference can be engaged, and that if anything, it's incumbent upon leaders, which are about positive deviance, to push us forward. And so the basic sort of guiding intuition is that what lies beyond tolerance represents an important area for research and practice, and in the context of leadership studies, for thinking about how leaders can create cohesion among diverse followership, and again, without over-relying necessarily on shared goals, which may not always either evolve or be manipulatable. Shared identities, which research shows often have sort of backlash, to the extent that you try and promote a common identity, you often see subgroups reacting negatively. And the dual identity, which proves elusive and in practice actually seems to vacillate more, in the sense that dual identities seem to work, but to the extent that the subgroup identities become salient, you're still left with the conundrum of how can a leader begin to craft a cohesive followership out of a diverse following. And again, not just a diversity of individuals, but one in which there really are clear subgroups. So the term allophilia comes from the Greek. It's the prefix and suffix for liking or love of the other. And what I mean when I use it in a scientific sense would be that it's an unmediated positive attitude toward the members of a different ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, linguistic group, socioeconomic class, nationality, or even for that matter, a different division, school, or team. So it's really, what's critical is that there be an us and a them, and allophilia is trying to capture, and in a few minutes I'll talk about how we actually try and measure it, unmediated. And I'll talk a little bit about why that unmediated positive attitude is important. And we have a chapter coming out for the American Psychological Association, which is presenting the Allophilia scale. And in that paper, we argue, or we show, that if you're interested generally in the idea of how we can feel positive towards the other, there seem to be 5 sort of factors or forms or manifestation that it takes. It seems to involve feeling comfort, kinship, affection, engagement, and enthusiasm. And these all don't necessarily have to co-occur. So we've done research in different parts of the world. We did a study of Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. We've done studies of young kids in Singapore looking at mainland China. We've done plenty, most of our research has been in the U.S. among different ethnic groups. But we find reliably when we try and tap allophilia, or when we use the Allophilia scale, that these 5 factors emerge, and that feeling the different factors is associated with different behavioral orientations. So I'd like to, for many in the audience, they might say, wait a minute, where is intergroup liking in the literature? Because, there's so much literature on intergroup relations. I sort of sense or feel that I must have read something about liking. And at this point, I'd just like to sort of talk through some of the places that liking has occurred to intergroup researchers, but the extent of baggage and really, frankly, cynicism that they brought to the idea of liking the other. And so, in general, positive intergroup attitudes seem to be overlooked. And this is, when Wright and Taylor in 2003 did a review, they simply concluded that research and theory has been uninterested and thus unable to account for these cases. Again, I want to be clear. I'm not. The argument is not that allophilia is as common as prejudice. The argument is that allophilia stands independent from prejudice and is uniquely associated with specific intergroup behaviors. And if you just think of the number of scales we have to measure prejudice, and in the peer-reviewed literature, we counted over 182 for different forms of difference. What basically happens is researchers who are interested in studying positive relations across subgroups end up using prejudice scales. And again, those prejudice scales are designed to measure antipathy or hatred. So there's a real disconnect between the extent to which researchers can do sort of interesting work on the degree of positivity among groups when they're relying on scales that were designed to measure the degree of hate. The best that they can show is reductions in hate. And as we're going to see from some of the data that I'm going to cover today, that's not the same thing as showing the increasing in liking. And where liking does show up is there's research that looks at liking it that sort of suggests that it's impure at its source. So this would be work that argues that liking among difference is really pity or sympathy. And you can imagine that being the target of pity or sympathy, feeling and actuality being quite different in the behavioral manifestation. So if you have a national polity and you have one group pitying the other, that's not necessarily the grounds for creating a cohesive collective or a cohesive followership. There's other work that argues that it's not robust in its form. So this may be work that folks in the audience are familiar with, that when it's basically the shorthand argument would be that when you see evidence that groups have positive attributions for other groups, they often typically have negative ones as well. So some of the groups that they tend to study would be attitudes towards Asian Americans in the U.S., where it does seem that the majority groups and also other ethnic groups do have positive attitudes, but then they come back and say, well, alongside these positive attitudes, you also see evidence of negative attitudes. And so they argue that it's not robust. And this would be originally work by Fisk and Cuddy, has continued doing that work as well, and we have a paper that shows methodologically that there actually is a small set of people who feel positive across both dimensions. So it's not always a trade-off where if you like them on one dimension, you must dislike them on another. There actually are people who hold the other in positive regard and positive esteem. And then finally, there's a body of research that argues that when we like the other, that has negative consequences for them somehow. So, for example, there's work that shows that people may overcompensate on behalf of minority groups in certain contexts or situation. And so that work argues that, if you see liking, it's going to have negative consequence or impact for being liked. And when you begin to read this literature with an eye for consolidation, you come away very cynical because you really see all these attempts. You come away from it feeling that the worst thing that could happen in the world would be for members of different groups to like each other, which seems like a very sort of cynical or unsubstantiated place. So this model of intergroup leadership that sort of built up from this idea of thinking about not just reductions in dislike among groups, but reductions of like. It begins with the intergroup. This is shared by all intergroup work, which is that leaders have to bring together subgroups of individuals and not just individuals. And anybody who has, worked in the context of diversity, knows that it's not just individual diversity that presents as a problem, but people's affiliations with different groups and different affinity groups that they identify with. The second tenet is that positive and negative intergroup attitudes are independent dimensions of intergroup relations. They have distinct outcomes and distinct antecedents. And this is the most controversial one, and this is the one that I would say I've spent the bulk of my time, because anyone who's tried to tease apart semantically related construct, methodologically it introduces a lot of difficult sort of, you can very quickly get into sort of battles over statistics. But this is the assertion, and I'll show you how I've begun to triangulate on it. And then finally, the implication for leaders is that if you really want to create a unified collective from diverse subgroups, you have to reduce negative intergroup attitudes, reduce the negative prejudice, but you also have to increase the positive attitudes. And, the European Union, just as an example, has a center for thinking about ethnic difference, and it's the Center for Monitoring Xenophobia and Racism. And if you measure xenophobia and racism and you base institutional practice on xenophobia and racism, I would argue that there's only so far that you can go towards actually moving beyond, at best, tolerance, and tolerance, as many researchers have argued, is inherently an unstable situation. So here's a visual way of representing it, and at this point, when I'm face-to-face with an audience, I do something kind of odd with my hands, so it's kind of a cross between the yoga position. But if you see on the left-hand side, you see the traditional assumption, which is that, negative and positive really are a single dimension. And the assumption has been that to the extent that we reduce hate, we really are, moving closer and closer to what we want on the positive. On the right, you see a very different construal. It's not the argument that I would make, but it's the extreme case just to begin with, which would be that they're wholly independent, that liking a group has nothing to do with a negative group. And you see that in this representation, the more you like, it's really going in a different direction. So it's not, moving up and down. It's not the kinds of things that you ask when you ask about racism would get you to allophilia, but it's really about a different set of experiences, a different set of emotions, a different set of behavioral orientations. Now, what I would argue is that it's somewhere in between. So they're not wholly independent to the extent that you hate a group. You're not likely. It's negatively correlated, and this is what we find. But the important thing is that it's negatively correlated on average across a lot of studies and a lot of contexts. We tend to find about -0.5. So knowing how much we hate is not a good proxy for knowing how much we like. And the behavioral orientations are really important, and I'll show you a couple of quick slides that give you a sense of that. I'm going to go through this slide, then I think I'll pause for questions, because the two-dimensionality is something that folks often have questions or comments about. And in terms of, so if you hypothesize something, obviously you need support. Parallel research is one area. And so if you look at the work, for example, on emotions, at one time people thought happiness or sadness were mirror opposites of each other and could be measured unidimensionally. And in fact, now they find that they're really independent states, and that you can have happiness amid sorrow, and that you have to study, understand, measure, promote happiness independently than how you think about reducing or understanding and reducing, ultimately, unhappiness. There's other cases in which semantically related positive and negative constructs are not necessarily one-dimensional. So one of the areas that I've looked at would be research on trust and distrust. And, again, some researchers, for convenience, have a single scale that moves from trust to distrust, but other researchers who go in using more anthropological methodologies, or alternatively more sort of phenomenological, argue that trusting someone is a very different state than distrusting them, and said involves not just a degree of magnitude of difference, but really a different set of experiences. And then finally would be the direct evidence, where I've been focusing on, which is basically showing that different things come of allophilia than come of prejudice. And the basic argument is that you get proactive engagement and support to the extent that you have liking, and that predicts it much, much stronger than levels of prejudice or hate. And that's based on a lot of different work that shows feeling positive emotions seems to be uniquely associated with certain behavioral dispositions, and in particular about linkages and connections in general. So let me, I think I'd like to pause there and take some questions, and then I'll move on to just give an example of some of the ways that we sort of support it for this third bullet, the direct evidence. Hopefully I haven't lost all 140 of you.
One question, as we reflect on what you have showed in the current political environment, any thoughts about how this model might relate to the love or hate or allophilia or prejudice that's at play in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, it's interesting. Excuse me. So I've gotten 2 phone calls that came from 202, which is the area code of Washington, D.C. And one was from the Congressional Times Weekly, which said, Professor Pittinsky, you study love across groups. What can you tell us about how to get Democrats and Republicans to play together? And then the other one was, you study love of the other. Can you tell us who loves Americans and how we can increase their numbers? That came from a different department. That was actually from the State Department. For the politics, I think what I would do is refer you, one of the authors in the book takes this as specifically his focus. He's done offsites with Democrats and Republican Congresses and has tried to both understand but also promote cross-aisle collaboration. And so I think his chapter on it is much richer. So I'm not sure how we do this, but if you shoot me an email, I can send you a copy of his chapter from the book that deals directly with that.
Perhaps you can send it to Josh and he can attach it to the...
Terrific. Okay, any other questions? Okay, great.
About 20 minutes left, so I want to make sure.
Sure. Yeah, and let me just, give you a sense. What we do, or the basic methodology that we use, is we try and predict positive behaviors across different groups. And what we find, we do earlier someone mentioned game theory, so we have created little groups, and we try and get the groups basically to like each other. And I can, during a Q&A at the end, I can share a little bit about the experimental methodologies. But a lot of the work that we do is also just field work, where we look at attitudes as they naturally occur and then look at naturally occurring behaviors. And so this was an experiment. It's a quasi-experiment that we did. And so basically we ran, I think it was, yeah, so we ran close to 300. If I remember correctly, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 280 adults through two things. One is we collected a tremendous number of attitudes, of their naturally existing attitudes. And so along the left hand, you see we measured the extent to which they feel allophilia for Latinos. We used a scale called Pro-Latino Attitudes, which is, folks may be familiar with the there's an anti-black and pro-black scale by Katz, which was really tapping sympathy towards African Americans. And so we would argue that that's the impure at its source type of liking. We pitted it against universal orientation because this is very particular to the work that we've been doing and the argument that we've been making, which is that this is not measuring the extent to which you love everyone. It really is trying to tap the extent to which you feel positive towards a specific other group. And universal orientation is really is another, I can say complementary construct, but a distinct one, because folks who are interested in universal orientation are really everyone is one rather than us and them, and the allophilia model is us likes them. We looked at altruism because you can imagine that an altruistic personality would be motivated to help everyone. We looked at anti-Latino attitudes, which was a measure of prejudice, and then we used intergroup anxiety, which is an emotional. And really what we find reliably is that the allophilia scale is the strongest predictor. Excuse me, I said this was a quasi-experiment because the way we actually measured this was when we went to thank participants for participating, we offered them compensation. In addition, we said that we set aside some of their compensation and asked them to tell us which charities they would like it donated. And we calculated those who included and the extent to which they included a Latino scholarship fund in it. So it was actually real dollars that they were able to direct. We've done work looking at more institutional support for institutional remedies. And each time we do a study, we try and pit it against different types of prejudice measures, because you could argue that if we find allophilia outperforming a prejudice measure, it could be a function just of the particular prejudice measure that we selected. And so we go to the research and you'll see old-fashioned racism, modern racism, symbolic racism, colorblind racial attitudes. And the bolded is really what's important there is that, you know, allophilia is the stronger predictor, but in addition, it remains independent of the contributions of the other. So if you could only know one, it's the one that would be the most powerful to know. But in addition, if you can know a few, it's particularly powerful to predict the behaviors we're interested in. And I apologize if I'm sort of giving too little information for the folks who are interested in sort of statistical models, and if I'm giving too much information for the folks who are interested or who adopt other methodologies. I wasn't quite sure where to position this. We've also done some work looking at younger people and looking at their proactive support. And so again, if you think about people who go into schools, they're interested in reducing hate acts, you know, among kids who are different. And the slice, and it's admittedly a small slice, but the slice that this work is trying to predict which kids will actually stand up and say no, or, you know, protect the child from, you know, who potentially may be picked on because of his or her ethnic, national, or you can imagine sexual orientation, or any number of different forms of difference. So again, I would argue that that's arguably something very germane to leadership, because that's the individual who is going counter to the group and counter to the group in ways that I think most people would construe as pro-social or positive. So the implications for leaders, you know, we have to think about positive attitudes about other subgroups. They're not simply the absence of negative, they're different. And that what an aspiring intergroup leader will gain by promoting allophilia is different from what they gain by combating prejudice. Both tasks are therefore necessary. Now I want to be clear, these are the implications for leaders of the intergroup work that I've been doing, and the work that colleagues have contributed to the edited volume don't take this as their point of departure. And so we have Tom Tyler, who's interested in justice models and looks at the challenge of justice. So we've got Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, who's interested in sort of institutional practices that promote collaboration, and so she looks at the institutional practice. So I want to be careful not to suggest that this is the only route to intergroup leadership or leadership that creates cohesion among the subgroups, which are often overlooked in leadership models, but it's the particular sort of slice that I've been most interested in. The metaphor that I often use with students, which I find helpful to sort of get my head around, is that if you think of a garden, you know, there's at least two activities. One is pulling up the weeds, and you could argue that would be reducing the xenophobia, the racism, but if you pull the weeds, you're not necessarily left with a garden, right? You also have to proactively, you know, plant flowers or things that will bloom. And the two activities really are independent. You have to do both. Another model that I sometimes use with more organizational settings is if you think about a balance sheet for an organization. Income and debt, you know, clearly are related. Together, they determine the financial well-being of an organizational enterprise, but they're not mirror opposites. So to the extent that you reduce your debt, you're not necessarily generating income. They're two separate activities. They're two separate enterprises, inextricably intertwined, and so you have to sort of keep your eye on both of them. So I want to, I'd like to leave it, yeah, I want to leave time for the for more general Q&A. Do you have a sense, Janet, of the questions? Should I go to the application or jump right to questions?
We have about 5 questions. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
And so I'd like to, if you want to.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. And then I hope people don't get dizzy, but I'm just going to flip to one slide that if we have time at the end, I'd like to talk people through. Okay.
One question, have you looked at the work done on multi-team systems? It seems like it seems like that would fall under the positive attitude, us liking them a good bit of the time.
So I've definitely, I'm not familiar with the phrase multi-team systems. I have done, I've benefited from comments from Barry Oshry from Power and Systems, who looks at sort of horizontal hostility, and then one of my advisors, Richard Hackman, has sort of, you know, done some really, really important work on teams, and he's sort of shared some of the insights on how researchers think about it. I guess I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about the insight, but I've certainly jotted it down as an area to look. It is certainly the case, and this may be part of what the question is surfacing, is, you know, this is definitely alive in team systems. The only difference or distinction that I would draw is that teams are often, for all the challenges they present, they're often much more bounded. So if you look at the intergroup work that's done also on education, so if you look at things like the Jigsaw Classroom, there's a level of architecture there which is possible because at the end of the day there is an organizational hierarchy and there is a leader, however nebulous those systems are. And so part of the challenge that I've had is exporting some of the insights or wisdom from those more bounded systems where you have a teacher at the front of the classroom, and he or she can really break the groups up, can give them complementary resources, can set them on equal status, you know, versus dealing with things like the earlier question raised, well, what about politics, where it's, you know, at the end of the day, it's really an us and a them, and the act of leadership is both formal and informal. So the person who has formal leadership doesn't necessarily have informal leadership, and the challenge is there. So I'll certainly follow up on it, and I appreciate them sort of sensitizing us to the team context as one in which these issues are very much alive. The only difference I would draw is that the work becomes much more confusing to the extent that the system is unbounded, like a political system or like cross-national relations.
That bridges to this next question. In the dual identity, what happens to them is the us, if the us is the dominant culture group and sets the agenda, does the we then become what us designs? Does it go from being unbounded to bounded in some ways? What's your thought on that?
Could you repeat the question? Because it's provocative, and I'm not sure I'm
the dual identity,
yes.
What happens to them if the us dominant culture is the dominant culture group?
Yes, so I think I share with the questioner sort of a concern about the dual identity model, because at least for me, and it may be the case that this is what the question is giving voice to, there is a concern. The dual identity model says us and them, us and we, but the issue is, okay, but that includes two different dynamics, and so it's really just a bundling of the dynamics of us and them and a we, and it's not a status point. It really is just recognizing both exist. So you're sort of left with the conundrum of how to think of an us and them, and I think they're raising the point that the us and them can often be simply an unequal status, where the us and them is, perhaps nominal, but if you look at it in any kind of practical way, be it economic power, be it political power, it really is us over them. Janet, does that sort of, it's unfortunate that I can't ask the sort of audience in general.
Person with this address. We did get a comment about multi-team systems.
Oh, yeah.
In response to your question, that it's an organizational concept. John Matthew, Michelle Marks, Steve Zaccaro, the military and homeland security are looking at it, how to get distinct teams to work together more effectively.
Yes, exactly. Okay, and actually, so the work that I mentioned earlier, I have, so in terms of the area that I know is the work that's being done on intelligence teams, and the basic sort of intuition or concern is not, when they talk about connecting the dots, that there really is a level of different groups in the government having different vested interests, different identities, and not just sharing it, not because they didn't see a value to sharing it, but for all the sort of dysfunctions or breakdowns that group systems can sort of introduce. So I am familiar with the literature on how to, or somewhat familiar with the literature on trying to get information and secret sharing, or what's perceived as a quote-unquote secret within one group, how to get it actively shared with others. And arguably, it's an area where you could think that the balancing an impulse to advance the interests of the own group, the own division, the own agency really has to be tempered with some overarching interest. And I've got a short piece coming out in Leader to Leader that's talking really about groups in organizations and how to use some of the practices or principles to get groups working together. But it's certainly a related construct, and one that I think is going to yield some important insights.
We have about 5 minutes left to go in our official time, but I've just received word from ILA that we can go over a little, and there are two questions in particular.
Okay.
I want to call to your attention, and then we'll allow very intriguing empathy error. First of all, regarding your emphasis on positive attitudes, can you comment on the appreciative inquiry approach based on the work of David Cooperrider?
Yeah, it's wonderful. It really is. Think about it would be that it potentially would be appreciative inquiry in the context of intergroup leadership, in the context of leadership studies, or really in the context of intergroup relations. And I don't understand why. There's a few complementary streams. You could look at the work on positive deviance in the development community is just incredible. Where these researchers are able to go into a place and instead of studying the 99 families that get sick, they study the one family that seems to be able to maintain health even in very, very, very aversive conditions. And they find, potentially very low cost but very powerful things that the family is doing that can be quickly disseminated and shared with others. And so that's sort of a complementary, and then I would argue that some of the positive psychology work is also complementary. And I guess the difference is, and I would love thoughts if anyone can shoot them offline or after this, but we seem too cynical in terms of thinking that this can be done in the context of us and them. There's something about difference, and again, I'm devoting a whole book to trying to pull it apart, but somehow we lose the ability to think creatively about what the different combinations are, and that game set theory, the outcome table for the experiment that I mentioned earlier. We look at developmental literature and we see that kids are naturally curious about difference, and somehow we fast forward, and for a bunch of reasons, I'm arguing, and some of it's reasons in the world, some of it's reasons in our head, some of it's reasons in the sort of institutions of scholarship, we just don't take that approach when we think of us and them. So I think a very apt way to sort of summarize this would be to think about appreciative inquiry in the context of intergroup relations. And I should mention, when we did our work, among Jewish and Arab Israelis, we were told by the funder that, you're not going to find this. And we actually found 15%, in both populations that felt not just, tainted regard or not just cynicism, but actual positive regard. Were able to appreciate the other, and that, we would argue, that's a very powerful minority that can be very tapped and arguably can become leaders in some of the most conflicted areas.
The last question, although it's not the last question we've received, they keep coming in, so thank you all, and maybe, Josh, we could collect the questions and give people a flavor of what we didn't get to. But this question has to do with something very current. I guess your model, I presume is what this is, would have importance for leadership dealing with emergency situations such as Katrina and Haiti. At the same time that you are reducing diversity between the teams working to save people, you also have another group that is made up of the external population who is impacting with negativity, where developing a positive attitude is critical. Do you feel that you could use this with large populations instead of the small groups that make up more traditional teams?
Okay, so this is going to sound like I planted it, but but please, John, confirm for the larger group that I didn't. But
sharing.
Well, I can share the empathy error data, and I think it'll provide some insight or address that really interesting or important concern. So one of the one of the ways to show that this positive regard among subgroups is really different than negative regards is to show different things cause it. To date, I've really been interested in showing that it leads to different things. So to the extent that you feel it, you're likely to behave differently. But another way to pull them apart or to show their relative independence is to show that different things lead them. And so what we did, this was a naturalistic study. So we have not experimentally shown it yet, but the evidence from the field is just very powerful. We looked at young people. So this was these were middle schoolers. They were in the Midwest, which in the U.S. is largely homogeneous, although not exclusively homogeneous. And we studied the extent to which, or we studied kids in school districts in which there was a sizable ethnic minority group, typically one, and we measured their attitudes. And what we basically showed was that if you measure how much sympathy they have for the members of the minority group, it is a significant predictor or associated. It is significantly associated with the levels of prejudice. And so the more sympathy, and this is the graph on the left-hand side, the more sympathy they feel, the less prejudice they feel. But interestingly, feeling sympathy did not increase the degree of liking, and it also didn't increase any of the affiliative behaviors. So the extent to which they felt sympathy for the minority, they didn't necessarily sit with them in the cafeteria. They didn't necessarily report wanting to learn, or they didn't report wanting to learn more about their culture. They did hate them less, which you could argue is an important, to the school and district leadership, but they didn't like them more. And then what we found was that the extent to which, oh shoot, sorry, I cut a slide out. But what did predict the extent to which they So now it would be great if I could see you, because I could kind of flip my hands in a way that would show how the curve went in the other case. But basically what did modulate levels of allophilia was the extent to which they felt empathic joy. And so the extent to which they felt, they adopted the perspective of the other, which is sort of endemic to sort of the empathic experience, but felt joy or happiness and not sympathy or sorrow, predicted how much liking they had for the other group in the direction you'd expect. So the more empathic joy they felt, the more they were able to not only hate them less, but actually be proactive, supportive towards them. And the connection that I would make to the caller's very important concern is if you look at media construals, which is a lot of our exposure to us and them, they tend to be heavily weighted towards either hate acts, which sort of serve really to reinforce that hate is normative or hate is what people do, and or they tend to evoke sympathy or sorrow. But sympathy or sorrow for the other is not a strong predictor of proactive behavioral support. And so what our data would suggest is that you actually have to think about how the other is presented and recognize that sympathy or sorrow can motivate some behavior, but that you have to tap a fuller set of emotions and even go all the way to feeling joy or understanding the other in a joyous context to actually feel positive regard or positive behavioral dispositions towards them. So I hope that wasn't too gratuitous a slide back to the data, but I feel that it addresses the question, which is a good one, which is, you know, if you think about the larger context, how are attitudes in general shaped among the large set of people who aren't necessarily in one of the two groups. Our work on the empathic error, and the error would be over-focusing on sympathy or sorrow and underappreciating the power of empathic joy.
Sounds like a good wrap-up, too. And as I listened to you, Todd, I thought those of us in the U.S. who have access to National Public Radio this morning, they actually played recordings of the people in Haiti singing songs in the
Mm-hmm.
that you know, that resonates to me with what you just said.
And the prediction would be that the people who sort of had exposure to that too rare a media construal would actually think and behave much more positively towards the group than those who simply had exposure to all the you know, the awful suffering and sorrow.
Thanks to everyone who is on the call. You'll be glad to know that people stuck with us. We have almost as many as we started out with, so that's testimony to your presentations.
Well, I appreciate everyone making time to listen, and certainly anything offline that you're willing to share or able to share, I'd certainly be appreciative of.
We have an opportunity to do that on ILA Space, so I want to encourage those of you who are on the call who are members of ILA. Josh will post the questions on ILA Space, and we can continue the dialogue there. I also want to put in a plug for the ILA Public Leadership Member Interest Group. This is very much what we're all about, talking about how government, the nonprofit sector, volunteerism, and a whole variety of public leaders interact and build and support and play in the larger world. We're a forum for those who study or help lead nonprofit, social, civic, political, and government institutions. So please contact me or Josh Tarr at ILA. You can find both of us on the website if you're interested in that. I would also encourage you, if you're doing research or have insights from practice relative to public leadership, to put in a proposal for the ILA conference coming up this October in Boston. And even if you don't try to propose, certainly try to attend. One more reminder, within the next 48 hours, the webinar will be rebroadcast to everyone who attended. So I think I've covered all the ILA business, and I really, really appreciate you all participating. I think that this starts our year of webinars really well. Thank you, Todd, for giving an excellent presentation. And
You're
to
very
everyone,
welcome.
wherever you are, whatever time it is, have a great day.
Take care.